Resident Evil is an iconic franchise. The original was an instant classic and made the series the one to beat all the way back in '96. Resident Evil is the horror franchise, and the first 4 mainline games are an important and cherished part of gaming history. What's wild is how Capcom has updated its classics. The original Resident Evil Remake was released on GameCube back in '02 and showed how to update a classic experience with not only improved sound and graphics, but also small adjustments to the gameplay formula. The game was a success and was re-released on newer platforms in 2015. Now Capcom did it again with the Resident Evil 2 remake in '19. The game had not only been adjusted, it had been remade to suit the gaming standards of today, while still preserving the most important bits and the vibe of the original game. Since then we've seen a Resident Evil 3 remake and a Resident Evil 4 remake, but what's next for Resident Evil remakes? Resident Evil 4 mixed action and horror together in an explosive cocktail that was simply amazing. But with the release of Resident Evil 5, some of the magic was gone. Some of the criticism back in the day was aimed at the lack of survival horror and the shift towards an increased focus on action. Furthermore, the game had some major issues when it came to your AI-controlled partner. They would act beyond stupid, use up all of your ammo, and continuously get into trouble. Now, the game was not by any means a failure, and it was praised for a lot of its gameplay elements and at the time some amazing graphics. It's to this day a very competent and entertaining action game. At the same time, it's the Resident Evil that once and for all waved bye-bye to the franchise's survival horror roots. Resident Evil 4 did it subtly, but with 5 there was no way back. The franchise had morphed into an action blockbuster. 5 is not regarded as a masterpiece, and it's not looked back upon with the same fondness as the earlier games in the franchise, but still it's a successful game that has delivered hours of fun and entertainment to a bunch of gamers out there who are without a doubt ready to be hit with nostalgia. I just don't see it for the franchise. I don't think Resident Evil 5 will be the next remake, and I'll try to explain why. Resident Evil 7 is regarded as a return to form for Resident Evil and Capcom. Survival horror was back as a solid foundation for the game. I played the game in VR, and the first couple of hours of the game had my heart pounding and gave me the chills. Escaping Jack Baker in this old decrepit house was scary, and it was easy to fail, but perhaps more important was the lack of a missile launcher or a machine gun to take care of my problems. This was not a game rooted in action, it was rooted in horror. Resident Evil 7 is a good horror game, and Resident Evil 5 is a good action game. The problem is, as you might have guessed, Resident Evil 6. This installment of the franchise is considered a stinker. It does have a small following who consider it a cult classic simply because it's so bad it's good. Now, I've tried to love Resident Evil 6, but like many others, I wasn't capable of it. It's like a really bad action movie with an emphasis on action. It's about twice the length of Resident Evil 5, but it feels way longer. The game does things okay, never good, and the gameplay is always just alright and never really entertaining. It's not a bad game by itself, but compared to its predecessors, it kinda is. Resident Evil 6 is not a horror game, it's a mediocre action game. And coming after 5, which was also criticized for the emphasis on action, 6 kinda ruined Resident Evil as a horror franchise. If Capcom chooses to remake Resident Evil 5, they are walking down the path where Resident Evil turns into an action franchise instead of a horror franchise. And the way they handled 7, I don't think Capcom is interested in taking the franchise down that road. 7 did everything it could to shed the remains of Resident Evil 6 and did it successfully. Now, even with competition from Dead Space and Bloober Team, Resident Evil is once again the #1 horror franchise, and I don't think Capcom would like to lose that position as they did before. Instead of 5, I think Capcom should remake Resident Evil. To go back to where it all began and give it the modern Resident Evil remake treatment would make sense. Resident Evil is a horror game, and an iconic part of gaming history. To be able to have Resident Evil 1, 2, 3 and 4 remakes side by side would make perfect sense. These first 4 games truly shaped survival horror from the beginning to when it took a turn towards action. To be able to have a modern retelling of this evolution would be great, and right now all we are missing is a remake of Resident Evil. Not 5, but the original.